Your great-grandmother was delivered by a midwife. Her mother was delivered by a midwife. Every human being in history, going back tens of thousands of years, was delivered by a midwife. For all of human existence, birth was handled by women who had been trained by other women who had been trained by other women before them, an unbroken chain stretching back to the beginning of our species. Then, in 1910, two men with very deep pockets decided that 80% of American medical schools were teaching the wrong kind of medicine. Within 30 years, midwifery was illegal in most states. The women who had delivered every baby in American history were suddenly criminals, and the knowledge they carried, knowledge that had been passed down for generations, began to die with them. A comment on my last video stayed with me longer than I expected. A man wrote that his grandfather, who had survived the orphan trains, told his grandchildren something strange before he died. He said, if you want to live a long, healthy life, stay away from doctors and hospitals. I found myself wondering what that man had seen. What had medicine looked like to someone born in the 1890s? What was he comparing modern hospitals to? What did he know that we have forgotten? So I started researching what American medicine actually looked like before institutions took over. And what I found was something I had never been taught. Something that had been erased so completely that most Americans don't even know it existed. Before 1751, America had no hospitals, not a single one. The first hospital in the colonies was Pennsylvania Hospital, founded in Philadelphia by Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Thomas Bond. But somehow, people had been healing for 150 years before that. Babies were born, bones were set, fevers were treated, infections were managed. People lived and died, but they did it without hospitals, without insurance companies, without pharmaceutical corporations, without medical licensing boards. So what did they have? They had midwives. In colonial America and through most of the 1800s, midwives delivered approximately 95% of all babies born on American soil. These weren't amateurs practicing medicine without training. These were women who had apprenticed for years, sometimes decades, under experienced practitioners. They knew the complications. They knew the warning signs. They knew when to intervene and when to let nature take its course. They had been doing this work since before written history. And they had gotten very good at it. They had herbalists and root doctors. Every community, whether it was a New England village or a southern plantation or a frontier settlement, had someone who knew which plants reduced fever, which bark eased pain, which roots could draw out infection. This knowledge wasn't written in textbooks that could be purchased at a store. It was passed orally from practitioner to apprentice, from mother to daughter, from healer to community member. It was living knowledge, constantly refined through experience and observation. They had what historians call kitchen medicine. This was the baseline medical knowledge that almost every household possessed. Women kept small gardens of medicinal plants behind their homes. They knew recipes for poultices and tinctures that had been handed down through their families for generations. They understood basic wound care, fever management, digestive remedies, pain relief. Medical knowledge wasn't concentrated in institutions that you had to travel to and pay to access. It was distributed across entire communities. Every household was its own small pharmacy, and they had formal schools teaching this approach. The Eclectic Medical Institute was founded in Cincinnati in 1830. For over 100 years, it trained physicians in botanical medicine. These weren't quacks operating out of back rooms. These were trained doctors using plant-based treatments that had been refined over generations. They had clinical outcomes they could point to, they published medical journals, they conducted research. They had a century of institutional knowledge and thousands of practicing physicians across the country. But then something happened that would change American medicine forever. In 1910, a man named Abraham Flexner published a report that would transform how Americans think about healing. The Flexner Report was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation and funded by both Carnegie and Rockefeller money. These were not neutral philanthropists. These were men who had already reshaped American education through their foundation grants. Now they turned their attention to medicine. Flexner himself was not a doctor. He had never practiced medicine. He had never treated a patient. He was an educator with strong opinions about what proper medical training should look like. He visited 155 medical schools across the United States and Canada, spending sometimes only a few hours at each one, and he determined that most of them were substandard. His criteria for what counted as adequate were based on a specific model of medicine, one that emphasized pharmaceutical intervention, laboratory science, and hospital-based training. The result of his report was catastrophic for American medical diversity. Within a decade, 80% of American medical schools were closed, not reformed, not improved, not given resources to meet new standards. Closed entirely, erased from existence. 5 of the 7 black medical schools in America were shut down following the Flexner Report. Howard and Meharry survived. The other 5 were eliminated, cutting off medical training for black Americans during an era when white institutions would not accept black students. The impact on healthcare access for black communities would last for generations. Every single school teaching homeopathic medicine was closed. Every school teaching eclectic or botanical medicine was closed. The Eclectic Medical Institute, which had been training plant-based physicians for 80 years by the time Flexner visited, was gone within 2 decades. A century of institutional knowledge was erased. Thousands of trained practitioners were delegitimized overnight. Their degrees became worthless. Their practices became suspect. The schools that survived were the ones that adopted the model Flexner recommended, a model that required expensive laboratory equipment, a model that needed hospital affiliations, a model that emphasized the treatments that could be patented and sold, a model that happened to align perfectly with the business interests of the men who had funded the report in the first place. But the Flexner Report was just the beginning of the transformation. The real destruction came state by state over the next 50 years, as midwifery was systematically criminalized across America. The campaign against midwives was led by the American Medical Association, which had been fighting what it called irregular practitioners since the mid-1800s. The AMA had a professional interest in eliminating competition. Midwives charged less than physicians. Herbalists offered alternatives to pharmaceutical products. These practitioners represented a threat to the emerging medical monopoly. The argument made to the public was safety. The argument was that trained physicians in hospitals could deliver babies more safely than community midwives who had been doing this work for centuries. The argument was that modern medicine, with its scientific approach and institutional backing, was simply better. The evidence for these claims was questionable at best. In many European countries that retained midwifery systems, maternal and infant mortality rates were comparable to or better than American rates. Countries like the Netherlands, where midwives continued to deliver most babies, had outcomes that American hospitals struggled to match. But the campaign succeeded anyway. The money behind it was simply too powerful to resist. Between 1900 and 1960, state after state passed laws restricting or eliminating midwifery practice. Some states required midwives to work under physician supervision. Others required training credentials that could only be obtained through medical schools that had been closed by the Flexner Report. Others banned the practice outright. Alabama was one of the last holdouts. The granny midwives of rural Alabama, many of them black women serving black communities that had no access to segregated white hospitals, continued practicing into the 1970s. These women had delivered thousands of babies over careers spanning decades. They had lower complication rates than many hospitals. They were trusted by their communities. And then they were regulated out of existence, too. The last of them died without apprentices to carry on their knowledge. And here is the part that haunts me most. The knowledge these women carried was oral. It wasn't written in textbooks that could be preserved in libraries. It wasn't stored in archives that historians could access later. It existed in the minds and hands of practitioners who had learned from practitioners before them. When you criminalize the practitioners, you don't just stop the practice, you kill the knowledge itself. A midwife who cannot legally practice cannot take on apprentices. An herbalist who fears arrest cannot teach her daughter which roots to gather and how to prepare them. A tradition that took 1,000 years to develop can be severed in a single generation, not because it was wrong, not because it didn't work, but because the people who carried it were made into criminals. What replaced this distributed system of community-based healing, pharmaceutical dependence, hospital births, insurance paperwork? A medical system where knowledge is concentrated in institutions rather than communities, where healing requires credentials issued by approved schools, where every interaction flows through corporate intermediaries, where the patient is a consumer and health is a product to be purchased. Now, I want to be honest about something. Maybe medical standardization saved lives. Certainly some folk remedies were ineffective or even dangerous. Certainly some of the schools Flexner closed were genuinely inadequate. Maybe hospital births, with their access to emergency surgery and blood transfusions, really did improve outcomes for high-risk pregnancies. I am not a doctor. I am not qualified to make those medical judgments, and I want to be careful not to romanticize a past that had its own serious problems. But I keep coming back to questions I cannot answer. Why were the same men who redesigned American schools, the same foundations that funded the replacement of one-room schoolhouses with industrial education, also the ones who redesigned American medicine? Was this coincidence, or was there a pattern? Why close schools that had been successfully training doctors for 100 years? Why not reform them? Why not provide funding to help them meet new standards? Why was the solution elimination rather than improvement? Why criminalize midwifery when it had worked for all of human history? Why not regulate it, improve it, integrate it with hospital systems? Why make the practitioners themselves into criminals? And why was the old knowledge oral in the first place? Why did communities keep their medical wisdom in memory rather than in books? Maybe because they understood something we have forgotten? Written knowledge can be controlled by whoever controls the printing presses and the libraries and the schools. Oral knowledge belongs to the community. It cannot be bought, it cannot be licensed, it cannot be made proprietary, it cannot be owned by a corporation. But that same quality that made oral knowledge free also made it so easy to kill. Your great-great-grandmother knew things about birth and healing that we have lost forever. That knowledge existed in an unbroken chain for thousands of years. It was severed in a single generation by men with foundation money and a vision for what American medicine should look like, and you were never taught that it existed.